Hi, everyone, and welcome back to The Wheelchair Activist. This is a podcast hosted by me, Emma Vogelman, where I interview some pretty amazing disabled people, as well as some amazing allies of the disabled community. Today, I'm so excited to be interviewing Vicky Foxcroft. Vicky Foxcroft is currently the Shadow Minister for Disabled People. She is also the MP for Lewisham, Deptford. I'm so excited to jump into this conversation with Vicky and learn about how she champions the rights of disabled people in Westminster.
The one thing that I've heard kind of time and time again is that people want to be seen for what they can do, not what they can't do. I kept asking the Prime Minister about British Sign Language interpretation at his press conferences, and kind of after the first time of me getting in and asking, I thought it would just happen because it's actually not that difficult to do and sort out. And then after my fourth time of asking and it still wasn't done, I just thought, and we really do need to diversify, Parliament. I mean, yes, in terms of disabled people, but actually also, in terms of women, in terms of BAME representation, and in terms of people from different backgrounds. So, more working class people into Parliament.
Vicky, thank you so much for joining us on The Wheelchair Activist. I know how very, very busy you are, so I appreciate it so much that you've taken the time to talk to me today.
No, not at all. Thank you for inviting me on.
For people who don't know you or maybe sort of know you by name but don't understand fully what it is that you do, would you mind sort of telling our listeners about you and what you do, please?
So my name's Vicky Foxcroft and I'm the Member of Parliament for Lewisham, Deptford, and I'm also the Shadow Minister for Disabled People. So I, go to Parliament and, represent people. I'm with the Labour Party, so unfortunately we're not the government, but hopefully we'll change that one day and we'll be in charge of everything.
And for people who don't know what the Shadow Minister for Disabled People is, can you tell us what does that role entail?
So I shadow or, kind of hold to account the government's Minister for Disabled People. So we have opportunities to do that in Parliament. But also one of the things that I've done since taking on the role and that I think is really important is to hold a lot of road shows across the country and the nations to make sure that I hear directly from disabled people and disabled people's organisations about what their issues are, now, but also into the future, and how we can really focus on having a more inclusive society where disabled people are at the heart of it.
And I think for people who sort of may know your name vaguely, what I find so interesting about the work that you've done is advocating for, particularly during lockdowns and throughout the pandemic, is proxy voting in Parliament. So not being sort of physically there, but still being able to carry out your role as an MP and vote in sort of, key decisions. And I think that struck me as an initiative that, if it were to continue, could encourage more disabled people to be MPs and should be more involved in government. So could you tell us a little bit about that experience for you?
Yeah, and I think your kind of points around, Parliament and its inaccessibility, we've got that one in terms of the buildings and getting around. Actually, in terms of the hours, quite often we'll be sitting on a Monday. So by sitting, I mean in Parliament and voting and so forth, but till like 10 p.m. or later, and Tuesday, Wednesdays, 7 p.m. or later. And by later, sometimes I can mean 1 or 2 in the morning. And I think for everybody, that's unpleasant. But if you have a disability that impacts on you, those are, huge barriers in terms of participation. And during COVID, in Parliament and actually across the country, we went and saw very quickly that things that weren't available to disabled people and other people, actually, when they had to happen, they did happen. So I was able to contribute in Parliament remotely like this. I was, when it was allowed, Jacob Rees-Mogg was constantly trying to stop all of this, by the way. But I was able to contribute in debates, in questions, in statements. And the other thing, and this didn't last for very long, but we were able to vote remotely. And, Jacob Rees-Mogg kept saying stuff like, oh, if you're all outside sunning yourself while you're voting. She's just ridiculous. Like, I wasn't doing that. I was shielding. So I wasn't even allowed to go out and empty my bins during that process. So the idea I was outside sunning myself and actually I hadn't wanted to get back to, kind of being out and about and seeing people in person and so forth was kind of for the fairies. But I think the serious point is, that things could be reformed to actually make Parliament more accessible. And sadly, all of that technology and stuff that showed that was possible, hasn't been taken on board in the future. And we really do need to diversify, Parliament. I mean, yes, in terms of disabled people, but actually also, in terms of women, in terms of BAME representation, and in terms of people from different backgrounds. So, more working class people into Parliament.
I think that that's so crucial because the only way that we can expect our government to reflect the population is for the government to reflect us as well. And having those voices and those different lived experiences in the room is crucial. And I suppose I'm really curious as to sort of how do you go about trying to bring disabled issues to the forefront in a time where there are so many conflicting priorities in government? But how do you do that? And why is it so important to you that you do that?
I mean, you'll be acutely aware, but, we talk about the cost of living crisis, which is affecting so many people. But actually, disabled people have an even increased, cost of living crisis. And we just saw in Parliament, the extra funding that was, given, which is obviously welcomed. But actually, for some disabled people, they were getting an extra £150. But then they were also losing the Warms Homes discount, which was worth, guess what, £150. So actually, no increase at all. And, one of the things that I've found is ever since I've had this role, so beforehand, I thought I was good on, disabled people's issues, but actually I have constantly learned, and in my engagement with disabled people, listening to the barriers that are placed, on a daily basis, and having a government that, really doesn't feel like it cares, and that really, at times goes and uses quite a lot of spin around stuff. Like the strategy for disabled people. Oh, we've consulted with all these disabled people. Oh, they're all happy with it. I'm like, okay, well, how come I haven't spoken to one person who's happy with it? When I had to push to get the NatSem report published, which was, the real life circumstances on how disabled people are coping financially. Oh, they're all fine. Oh, right. Your research says that they're not, and constantly, just seeing, the way that disabled people are treated by this government. And it's, 20% of the population. And actually, if we get things better for disabled people, we're actually getting things better for the whole of society. And it's really, I feel really passionate about it, and whether or not I have this role forever or not, my experiences of meeting with and speaking with more disabled people than just in my constituency, which would have been kind of predominantly what I would have done beforehand, has changed me and made me, more and more passionate about making sure that we have to make sure your voices are heard in Parliament, and I hope one day that we have far greater representation in Parliament, on local councils, of disabled people, because, it's about having skin in the game, isn't it? And it's your lives. So, you've got to be able to advocate for that.
Absolutely. And I think it will possibly shock a lot of listeners to this, knowing that there are only currently 5 disabled MPs, and sort of that stark lack of representation is something that really urgently needs to be addressed. So I suppose throughout your work, and as you sort of mentioned, your education on disability, what would you say disability means to you?
Well, the one thing that I've heard kind of time and time again is that people want to be seen for what they can do, not what they can't do. And actually, it's the barriers that are placed in society that stop people being able to do certain things. And, I think, to me, it really is just focusing on the amazing things that people can do, rather than that kind of, negative way, and seeing the positives out of doing that as well. Rather than thinking, oh, that's really difficult, we're going to have to sort this or sort that. Go, right, okay. When we do this, this is what we get at the end of that. So I think, to me, we really need to, have a positive view of what people can do, and make sure that we, shout and promote that a lot more. And also say, actually, society's still got so much more to improve, but actually it's a society's fault, and it's society's responsibility to make sure that it does that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think, I'm sure you've heard about the social model of disability so much, but it's the barriers that society puts in place for disabled people that disables people. And I think when people are trying to think of what the potential solutions to some of those barriers, a lot of responsibility does get put on government officials to remove some of the barriers, or to put in place legislation that will impact other people's ability to discriminate, or put in place unfair policies. So I suppose just on what you said about if we do things right by disabled people, it benefits so many others. And, I know I've mentioned this, but the virtual participation in Parliament was just something that really stood out to me as, why is that not continuing? Because of, people like yourself who were still shielding, but it was proven that it can work, and it did work, and it did benefit so many people from a safety perspective, but also those who had particular medical concerns around contracting COVID. But why is it, do you feel, that didn't continue? And what impact do you think that could have made if it did continue?
I mean, there are a lot of very traditional people in Parliament, and Jacob Rees-Mogg, one I've already named, but actually they're in charge of, or he was in charge at the time in terms of what happens on that, and so decided that participation, wouldn't continue. I think, his argument, not mine, was, oh, well, you get more robust debate in Parliament. So when somebody's speaking, you can have this thing called an intervention. Basically, you interrupt them and then make a point in terms of what they're saying. And he was right in terms of that not being, not being able to continue. But there are, kind of other ways. And you just think like, the late night voting, does that really need to happen in that way? And when people talk about, kind of the bars in Parliament and so forth, yeah. So in terms of like other potential kind of benefits and so forth, but I don't know, maybe when the decamp happens and, there's new, kind of things are done up, maybe some things will look to improve. But it's kind of, what I was saying about representation as well. You look at the House of Lords and that's better than the House of Commons in terms of disabled people's representation. But when they're there and things need to adapt and change, then they have to do it. But that's the reason why we need, we do need, better representation in Parliament.
I think that's a really good point about the number of members of the House of Lords who are disabled. I mean, the names could sort of roll off the tongue of, how many people there are who are doing amazing things on disability. But I suppose so. In the Commons at the minute, what do you feel are the biggest challenges for you as the Shadow Minister for disabled people when trying to put forward the issues faced by the disabled community? What's the biggest pushback that you're getting?
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, probably the biggest challenge is not being in government, actually. But also, when you are in government, you operate with a really big civil service team around you. And when you're in opposition, you don't. I think, like the government have gone and done a strategy for disabled people, and it's been deemed illegal by the High Court. And raising this in Parliament and then them just saying, oh, we're just ploughing ahead with it, that's a really big challenge. But the reason why it's such a big challenge is because they're not listening to, they're not co-producing, things with disabled people. So they're not getting it right. So that's kind of the biggest challenge. But, sadly, I actually don't think that they're that bothered.
And I think that's really, it's not surprising for me to hear you say that, but it is quite disheartening when there are, campaigners and activists like myself who are outside of Parliament trying to influence, but you saying that within Parliament, yes, in the opposition, but trying to advocate for, as you say, 20% of the population. And it's very frustrating, I think, to see government think of disabled people as this sort of other group that they will never be a member of, when we know that, disability can happen to anyone at any time, whether that's through an illness or an injury or, anything that comes up throughout your life. This is a group that you can very easily go into. And it's really difficult to see government not take that seriously and not see these issues as impacting everyone at some point. And I think, in terms of the national disability strategy, for people who sort of don't know about that, it was this strategy that was made by government about just under a year ago that was sort of meant to be this all singing, all dancing list of solutions for disabled people and some of the issues that we experience. And that issue now of that it is been ruled unlawful because they didn't properly consult with disabled people is really frustrating, not just from my own position as, a policy influencer who was trying to, sort of use that to our campaigning advantage. But how do you see the disability agenda going forward in Parliament now, where, this document that was created, this strategy, isn't able to be relied on? Are you still holding government to account for the promises that it made in that? Or how is it working?
Yeah, so we do these things in Parliament called written parliamentary questions. And if anybody looks at mine, they'll see there's literally thousands on each of the pledges within the strategy for disabled people. And where I'm not getting answers, which, you might be shocked to hear that happens quite a lot, I'm also submitting freedom of information requests on areas as well. So I am seeking to hold the government to account. One of the things that I find really shocking, so we kind of touched on COVID, at the start, and I kept asking the Prime Minister about British Sign Language interpretation at his press conferences. And kind of after the first time of me getting in and asking, I thought it would just happen because it's actually not that difficult to do and sort out. And then after my fourth time of asking, and it still wasn't done, and I went a bit kind of viral because I signed part of my question. And I just thought, and then you look at all of government communications and the fact that they're not all in accessible formats. And, you look at the benefit system and in terms of accessible formats, and you've got disabled people filling in things in the benefit system that aren't necessarily in their required accessible format. This doesn't make sense. Like, surely this is like one of the more simpler aspects of things to be able to sort out. And then, kind of on that, one example in terms of things that makes something better for everybody in society, put some of those humongous documents into easy reads, and actually it's better for us all. Like, I actually search out easy reads on so much stuff now because I'm like, gosh, yeah, this is quite handy. I can get to the chase a bit quicker in terms of stuff. And it's just I don't know, but I'm like, so when I kind of said about, myself and a small team, and we try really hard to make sure everything's accessible. And, we always ask people if there's, reasonable adjustments that are required or anything else. And, obviously I won't get everything right, all of the time, but, like now I do alt text on my images and everything that we can kind of do in areas where it's simple. But it's like, you've got this huge civil service department. All you have to do is, before anything goes out or online, pop it in the different accessible formats. That's it. And you just say, nothing goes online unless it's in all of the accessible formats and available. Like, that's it. They can spend, how many years was spent consulting on the strategy for disabled people, to make sure they got it right. But yet, I know that stuff was available in accessible formats, but actually kind of a lot of stuff from government isn't. So anyway, that's just me moaning.
No, I think that's all really interesting insight. And, on a previous episode, we spoke to Liam O'Dell, who was really trying to raise the profile of the lack of BSL interpreters at, government briefings that everyone was glued to at the time, trying to figure out what you were allowed to do next week that you're not allowed to now. And, it was crucial information, and the lack of accessibility in that, it was something that was just, once you realized that it wasn't there, it was so difficult to not be enraged when you saw the next one and it still wasn't there. And I completely agree with, the other accessible formats. I mean, it's, in my capacity at the minute as a policy advisor for Scope, when I'm looking at children and young people's issues, the government have just sort of created more work for themselves because we're looking at the SEND review, and that they've had to postpone the deadline for responses on the SEND review because there wasn't an easy read and accessible version of it. And you just think you're creating more work for yourself by not having that from the get-go, when it is easy to use the tools that are available, which are really great to make things accessible. So I definitely hear the frustration, and I feel that very much as well. So when you mentioned about doing the road shows where you're sort of going out and really engaging with disabled people and disabled people's organizations. What has sort of struck you the most, or what was something that was the most surprising to you as an issue facing the community that you might not have been aware of, or you weren't aware it was as serious as it is?
I don't know, because we did them all last year as well, and that was, in the middle of COVID. I mean, I guess I'm kind of saying sadly, not really surprised by anything now, but knowing, kind of knowing that it's everything, it is housing and accessible housing, it is transport and accessible transport and being able to get to work, it is workplaces and providing, reasonable adjustments, making sure that access to work is applied for, it is, it is, if you need to use the justice system, access to legal aid. I guess kind of one of the areas is that I find shocking is on disability hate crime. And a lot of people don't speak to us in the road shows about that. Actually, I kind of get that information elsewhere, because obviously people don't necessarily want to speak in front of other people about that. But kind of, the poor process all the way through from, the start of reporting and so forth. And kind of just, it's just sad. Like, and I'm almost like, I can't believe it, but it's true. And more needs to be done, about making sure that that's addressed and that it is seen as a serious crime.
I think that that's really important, and I completely agree. It's not a topic that gets spoken a huge amount about when talking about disability issues, but I think, online abuse of disabled people is something that comes up a lot, sort of in the circles that I'm in. You can really be really open and vocal about, an issue that impacts you, but then you have to weigh that up against the backlash that you may get. And, just from sort of my experience, I wasn't necessarily the victim of a hate crime, but I was very much worried about safety. I was involved in an incident with a taxi driver who tried to overcharge me because I'm a wheelchair user, and it ended up going to court, and it was decided in my favor. That he did discriminate against me under the Equality Act, and there was, very rightly news coverage around that, and I did various interviews and things, but then I got very worried when next time I was hailing a taxi, was that going to be a driver who sided with the driver who discriminated against me? And, sort of that very vulnerable situation that a lot of disabled people can find themselves in to be victims of a hate crime is very real and needs to be talked about more. So I suppose for the next few months for you, sort of, we talked about COVID and the impact that the government had on disabled people during that time, and sort of ignoring the issues that we were experiencing. What would you say now are your priorities for disabled people? You touched on the cost of living, but sort of what what are you dedicating your focus on?
Well, there's so many things at different times. So, we've got the levelling up stuff going through Parliament. So I work with lots of our other teams in Parliament. So, kind of around the housing, trying to push the government to make sure that the housing is accessible. So part of what I kind of do is just, get in with, different teams in order to make sure they're speaking with disabled people's organisations, and make sure we're raising those issues in Parliament. In terms of kind of bits of legislation that's due to be coming to us, you're going to have the terminal illness bill, which basically extends the time from 6 months to 12 months in terms of being eligible for that, which is important, and it's good that we've pushed the government to be able to get this. We're also going to have stuff at some point in the future on the universal credit and the migration of, all of the legacy benefits across. And so we're going to be pushing the government on a number of areas that we've got big concerns, particularly around those being worse off, but also 3 months and, the fact that you may lose your benefits if you've not done that application, within that time, as well as, there's always constantly things, kind of coming up to be raising in different areas. But I guess they're the ones that are coming up kind of the nearest at the moment. Oh, and as well as, for people who are immunocompromised, getting access to Evershield, which, surprisingly, the government still haven't ordered, any supplies of, which is, really worrying, especially for those people who, are still shielding. And, they actually, they know there's a drug, out there that they could be taking and actually be getting back to some, sense of normal for them.
I think that's so important because there are so many people who either through their conditions are immunocompromised or are on drugs that then make them immunocompromised when they're treating another condition. And so many disabled people are still very worried about going out and about. And, with no safety measures in place. So I think that those are all really important. And on a constituency level, how do you go about addressing issues facing your disabled constituents? Do you have more control over what's able to happen and sort of what's been your experience of issues on that level?
Yeah, so I do surgeries and have caseworkers who work with us. And the vast majority of, kind of issues that are raised are actually around the benefit system, and people either being sanctioned or, their PIP or universal credit, not being at the right levels. Having to do, the mandatory reconsiderations and then, appealing and actually getting it sorted at the end of all that. We also have an issue, with people, who's, not getting their immigration status sorted out. And actually the impact that has in terms of accessing the healthcare system, which is a really big issue and something we do a lot of work on. Obviously, we all know social care is really struggling. So at times we've got to do quite a bit of work in terms of writing to all of the different bits, local authority, NHS, et cetera, try and pull things together to get stuff sorted out there. We've got an increase in terms of people with mental health conditions. So really trying to kind of push our local mental health providers around, early intervention work. So I do a lot of meetings with the right organisations, but we also pursue a lot of people's personal cases as well, and they're kind of the main, things that are coming up.
What would you say to a disabled person who might be listening to this, thinking that they may want to engage with their MP on a particular issue? Maybe let's take a more personal issue. What would your advice be to them if they think, oh, well, is it worth it? Are they going to be able to do anything for me? Is it a course of action that you'd encourage?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have lots of disabled people who write to us and I say, oh, you need to contact your MP because I'm not your MP and we've not got the resources to be able to deal with everybody's. And, some have not had great experiences, but I think the vast majority probably have. And I probably get those who haven't had a good experience. But yeah, MPs, we can write in, we can, contact different people and quite often where something isn't right, we can resolve it. Now, it's in Parliament for us to argue around, changing the laws and what happens. So let's just take train stations and the inaccessibility of them. We can kind of try and champion on a local level, but actually we're fighting to try and get the funding from government. So I think I've got a couple of inaccessible stations still in my constituency, and it's about getting that funding from government to be able to do something about that. And we, but on the personal circumstances, definitely, you can email your MPs, you can just Google them and get their details. Quite often they have phone lines that you can use, and they'll also have surgeries where you can have appointments as well. And I say to some people who need an advocate to come with them to also bring their advocate in terms of the surgery as well.
I think it's really important that people are aware of those different avenues of engaging with their MP, because I think a lot of people may view them as sort of this person who technically represents them and their community, but never has any engagement with, but they can really be of help to you in those individual circumstances. Say if you're trying to challenge something on a local level. And that's a really important thing for people to know. And I suppose my next question is around something we touched on a little bit earlier, but about that representation of disabled people in government. I am aware that this is possibly a bit unfair, but if a disabled person was thinking that they might want to be an MP, but they don't know what does that job actually look like. I'm aware that that job could look very different to you depending on what day it is, but what would you say are the main parts of your job or your day if you're trying to describe the role to someone?
Yeah, you're right. It is really difficult to go and explain. It's a bit like when I said about the hours on Mondays till 10 or later, but we will be in Parliament. We will have the main chamber stuff, which people can kind of see on the telly. And we'll be debating lots of different issues in terms of stuff. But there's also other areas of influence in stuff. There's select committees. There's all parliamentary party groups that do stuff. So there's lots of different ways in Parliament you can look to go and influence things. And then there's the constituency side of stuff. So, we all hold surgeries. Doesn't mean anybody's getting chopped up. Constituents come and speak and meet with us. And you'll do other local things like visit schools, events. So last weekend, was a Jubilee weekend, but also locally for us, we had a Broccoli Max Festival, which is a celebration of arts, and you'll go around and you'll get to do all of that stuff. And I was offered an awful lot of cake, of which I had to turn most of it down because I'm not supposed to put on weight because of my rheumatoid arthritis. But I was quite tempted though. But it's quite varied. But the thing that I would say that is the most important thing, and for somebody, like myself from a very working class background, I didn't get any A's to C's in my GCSEs. I did BTEC Performing Arts, so not A levels. And then bizarrely went to university. I had to do my English at night school and did drama and business. I wasn't somebody that you would have thought would be a politician in the future. And indeed, if anybody would have asked me, I'd have literally laughed your socks off because I just wouldn't have seen me doing that. But I am. And when I kind of do chats at schools and so forth, I always say to kids, like, do go for things. It's not about what position you have, right? And I really, really firmly believe this. I was a councillor before I was MP. If you can't say what you're doing when you're doing that position, you probably shouldn't have the position. So when I was a councillor, we did the Save Lewisham Hospital campaign. We made sure the council remained a living wage employer. You won't know it, but Brockley Closh Junction, I got 3 pedestrian crossings around there. You also won't know it, but Brockley News, I made sure there was a community garden where there used to be loads of kind of explosions from tyres and so forth. It's about what you're doing when you've got whatever your position. So then with that, it is also about doing it in your own way. So I might not be or sound, like some of the politicians in Parliament, but it's about, right, well, you're going to do this your own way. So, where things aren't accessible, raise it, in whatever way you want to do it, but just make sure that you keep doing it, find your own way of influencing things. So when I was first elected, sadly, we lost a lot of young people to youth violence. And so I said the different committees and stuff that you could use. And I didn't really kind of know how to do it. So I didn't set up an all parliamentary party group, but I set up the Youth Violence Commission. And we kind of did it in a very different way that isn't really using the parliamentary stuff. Confession, partly because I didn't know what I was doing, but also because I wanted to make sure that it was academically led and vigorous, that we had young people at the heart of it, and that it stood up economically. Because I knew instinctively that not investing in our young people had a greater cost downstream, but I had to prove it, and we did it. And that's what I mean in terms of kind of, finding your own way and doing it in your own way and making your own alliances.
I think that's so interesting how you went about doing it. And I really love that, doing it in your own way, because, I'm always saying this, but disabled people can sometimes be the best problem solvers or the best creative thinkers because they have to think about how to do everyday things in a different way. So I think that could really resonate with people listening on how you can use whatever position you're in and change it to fit what you want. And I suppose my last sort of big question is, as a disabled person who might be, trying to put forward a campaign or an issue that is impacting them and lots of other disabled people, and they want to try and get it into, their MP or, sort of create bigger noise around it. What advice or what tips would you give them on things to include that will make government listen? And I'm aware that that's huge and that's really difficult to do, but what tips would you give?
Okay, so this isn't necessarily coming from being Shadow Minister for Disabled People. It's coming from being an MP. Lewisham Speaking Up in my area is a fantastic organisation. And what they do when they lobby me is they bring the whole group and present themselves rather than having somebody else speak for them. Do it in, easy read formats. Because there's a lot of people with learning disabilities, and And, just hearing, firsthand, what's important. And so I think kind of taking the issue there with as many people as you can get. I try and go about it in a respectful way, put forward your case. Even if you can be frustrated with politicians at times, and but do it in a professional way. Try and make sure there's some follow up. So ask them what they're going to do, or go with some asks like, can you table this written parliamentary question, or can you write to the minister about this? Or can you put forward, a private member's bill on this? But go and think about what the asks are from them. And then the other thing that I think is, join up with other disabled people and disabled people's organisations, get them to do it in other areas with their MPs, meet and discuss and find out how you're all doing in terms of taking it forward. Because, if you're there and, you're not joined up and working out what the collective is wanting, then you'll just have one MP doing one little bit of stuff. Whereas actually, if you got 500 MPs doing something, that starts to make a bit of a difference.
I think that's really great advice, and it rings so nicely with the advice that other people on this podcast have talked about, which is reaching out to other members of the disabled community to talk about lived experiences and to get sort of that peer support, but also trying to influence change, connecting with activists on social media who you see are also talking about the issues that you care about or are affected by, and working together. I think that's really great advice. And yeah, I just want to say a huge thank you for joining me on this podcast and taking up so much of your time to talk to me and to talk to our disabled and non-disabled listeners about what the amazing work that you're doing as Shadow Minister for Disabled People.
No, thank you for having us on.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Wheelchair Activist with Vicky Foxcroft. I learned so much about what the Shadow Minister for Disabled People does on a day-to-day basis, and it's great to know that we have an advocate like Vicky championing our rights in Westminster. Before you go, I want to remind you that we do have a GoFundMe set up for this podcast. We are 100% committed to accessibility here at The Wheelchair Activist, and we want to make sure that every bit of content is inclusive and accessible to all. Every donation allows us to continue doing this work, which includes captioning each and every episode and making it available on YouTube. Thank you so much to everyone who has donated so far and has allowed us to continue making this amazing podcast. Please give this podcast a share far and wide so everyone can enjoy the amazing content. This podcast has been hosted by me, Emma Vogelman, produced by me and Isabel Anderson, and edited by Joe Tapper. Thank you so much for listening, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.